Then we're going to go into the risks involved, the working conditions for both foreign correspondents and also the Chinese news assistants as well. That's an issue that we should also touch on. Lastly, the future of investigative reporting in China. If last year the blockbuster story was about the money trail, was about alleged corruption and wealth, what are journalists going to be digging into this year? What is going to be the hot story this year? And then at about 10, let me look at my clock, 10:20 a.m., that's when I'm going to open up our discussion here to all of you, because I know we have some extremely, insanely curious individuals out there who have some questions they want to ask these panelists up here. So let's begin. The first question, just want to ask you about your individual work. Neil, Natasha, and Edward, can you just go through one piece of investigative reporting that you did that you were particularly proud of? Share it with the audience.
Thanks, Christy. I guess the piece I'll talk about is the story we did last year on Xi Jinping, now the president of China. You have to look at it in the context. About a year ago in China, things were in a state of flux. Bo Xilai had been ousted. There was talk about corruption, and there was also a lot broader talk in the previous years of rising inequality in China, and that was a big concern for people in China. And a story that's not that easy to explain how it happens to the rest of the world. So Bloomberg started off by doing a story looking at some of the wealth that the Bo Xilai's family had, and they did that through corporate records in Hong Kong. We decided that it would be interesting to look at the people, not who'd just been removed from power, but those who were currently in power or coming to power. And if we could find a paper trail that would lead us to that. It was a hunch, and we started looking at several different people that we could possibly try and find a way into. There were rumors about certain Politburo members more than others. But sometimes, because of a lot of rumors, that meant information was very, very hard to find leads beyond rumors, and sometimes the impression that things may be rather too well hidden to find. But when it came, we did suddenly develop some leads on the person we ended up writing the story about, and once we started to get into, once we got that first break, then others started to come. I think that the hardest thing to do in these stories, and the same with the New York Times, I'm sure, for the Wen Jiabao story, was you got to figure out who these people are, who their relatives are, who their contacts are. And whilst in most countries that would be quite easy, it's sometimes really hard to prove that someone even has a sister, who that sister is, let alone the in-laws, the brother-in-laws, the son-in-laws, daughter-in-laws, who are often key to trying to unlock the connections. So we did that, and it was a very long process, very meticulous process. But at the end, we came across with a lot of investments that were hidden, and we brought them to public attention as a part to explain how China's system has worked in this huge period of wealth creation, and how certain people have benefited. And I think it was part of a number of stories last year by us and others that really shone a light on how China is working now.
Yeah, and Natasha, I know that you played a role, of course, in this coverage. I want to follow up with what Neil said, a question for you, Natasha. How do you separate fact from fiction and rumor from truth? How do you parse that as a journalist?
I think it has to do with a lot of really meticulous fact-checking, talking to everyone we can, and obviously our first duty is to be accurate, and I think the series that we did, it took us 9 months in total for everything, and it was really day and night, talking to really everyone we can, pursuing every lead that we came across. And when it came to, I think later on maybe we might touch upon social media. Sometimes you do have paragraphs there that you kind of say, I don't really think this sounds right. And it really is about, I guess, going back and talking to sources and talking to whoever we can to verify what we have. And for us, a lot of our stories last year was on documents. And, and one of the reasons why I think it takes so much time and attention and, a lot of concentration is to cross-check people, for example, their ID numbers. For example, Cantonese or Mandarin translations of their names. It really takes a lot of going through. And when we do find 2 pieces of paper among thousands that really do link 2 people that seem to be unconnected together, it was, a triumph, a little triumphs.
Yeah, very meticulous research, 9 months in the making. You're right, we will touch on social media as a tool and how to carefully use that. Before we go to that, Edward, want to get your thoughts on work that you did that you're particularly proud of.
Sure. I think the very first sort of investigative line of reporting that every reporter in China engaged in last year was the Boxilai story. And when that broke, the first Western organizations to sort of break mention of the murder as connected to Boxilai were Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. And then that sent all the other reporters in Beijing into scramble to sort of look at Bois, his family, and his connections. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to find out more about his life in Chongqing and find out sort of what kind of mini empire he had built out there. And we first got a tip to it because our bureau received an electronic audio recording from someone through a certain channel, and it was people who who had ties and associated with Bois' inner circle in Chongqing talking among themselves in a room. And in this recording, they were talking about sort of people they knew, sort of talking a little bit about the history of how Bois had set up his connections in Chongqing. So then I decided to fly out to Chongqing, made some contacts out there, and through that reporting and then through following that up with a look at some records, especially through the company registry here in Hong Kong, then we pieced together a picture of Bois, his ties to a billionaire named Xu Ming, who was, Forbes had said he's one of the 10 richest people in China, I think back in the late 2000s. And then also like some shadowy people that Bois was associated with, like a fixer that he had named Yang Saixin, who was a military intelligence guy who Bois brought over to Chongqing to help start setting up connections there. And, you hear, like Natasha and Neil were just saying, you hear a lot of rumors when you're reporting out these stories. And then the key is to cross-check them with other sources, but also to use both public records as well as open source material. You can actually find a lot of material in government websites in China, in state media reports. And like some of these names that we came across, like this guy Yang Saixin had never been mentioned by anyone in connection to the Bois family before. But then when we first heard about him through a source in Chongqing, then you look up his name, and he's actually has appeared in 1 or 2 media stories that the Chinese media had reported. It wasn't about Bois. It was a strange story in Chongqing about how he had 2 mastiffs or large dogs that had killed a man. And then, and so it's like you get these interesting tidbits, and they sort of help flesh out a picture. And then you can write a narrative story about sort of this inner circle with details and with color. And I think that, that's the type of story you're aiming for, is you're aiming to build a narrative of how this person got to this place, in this case, the Bois family, or sort of the life they built for themselves, using their wealth and their connections.
I have a very mechanical question. Again, we're talking about the nuts and bolts of investigative reporting. As you're dealing with so many sources, so many interviews, so many original documents, how important is it, how not important is it to know and be able to read Mandarin Chinese?
I'll go first because I don't read. So, we had a large team. We had reporters in China, in Hong Kong, and in the US. And the reporter in the US used to work in Beijing. But the reporters all read and can speak Mandarin Chinese. I was an editor, so a different process. So absolutely invaluable, both to have reporters and assistants in China who can help, and also people like Natasha, who's trilingual here in Hong Kong and actually did a phenomenal job of organizing our many, many bundle files of documents.
Edward, I know you took a sabbatical to brush up on your Mandarin Chinese before being posted to Beijing.
Right. I think that in terms of looking at documents, I think if you're one of the lead reporters on one of these stories, it's actually is a hugely time-consuming to do that. So a lot of times we would get these documents, but then ask our researchers to pour through them. It would just take too much time, and what we did was we spent time meeting sources and talking to sources. So, and I think that in that part, it's important to a degree to know Mandarin, because a lot of times on this type of story, you don't want to bring a translator with you. You might just want to meet a person, and then they don't necessarily. If you are starting to build a relationship with them, it's a little awkward if you have like a third person who's there, who's also hearing all the stuff. So sometimes, to a degree, it's helpful to have enough Mandarin where you can have a conversation, or at least have a conversation that you can record and get other things translated. But I do know that, my colleague David, he's not fluent in Mandarin, and he doesn't read Mandarin, and he did, the best China story that the Times produced this year, so it's not necessary either.
It is in the pursuit of journalism, reporting in motion, but it's also an exercise in project management too, right? You were talking about your role as a lead reporter,
right,
having Chinese news assistants. How do you divvy up the roles, as it were?
As I said, we had a large team, so we shared. We had a place where we could share all the documents securely that we were using across borders, and had message groups that everyone was in the loop. So, kind of at the start, we didn't know how difficult and how sprawling it would be. So the management system kind of evolved as we went, and by the end, you were like, if we'd actually worked some of this out earlier, we'd may have made things easier. But certainly everyone has different skills. Ed talks, we have reporters in Beijing who cover politics, and they go out very well and meet sources. And then we have others who are particularly good at really digging through documents, searching to make connections on the web. And there is a lot on the web, but it's not that easy to find unless you're really savvy at searching it. And then maybe Natasha could talk a bit about the role she played.
Yeah, I definitely think, as we mentioned, project management, and it really was, I think, after the Bo Xilai story and when we were doing the Xi Jinping story, we really realized that we had to have a better system. So, spreadsheets were actually very helpful. I guess no one goes into journalism thinking, but actually spreadsheets were incredible for this. And it was also very exciting when you actually do a search on a spreadsheet and you find a connect, for example, an address or a phone number or a shared family name. That was also very helpful, because you have your own, I guess, resource to mine for all these stories, especially, I guess, for the last story we did, which is on mapping the fortunes of the 8 immortals and 100 of their descendants. That's when it really became really invaluable, because it's 100 people, and we probably looked at 5 times that, in terms of people they work with and such. So that was important, to be able to have something that all of us could contribute to and build and then use as a resource.
Yeah, spreadsheets, an interesting tool for journalism. Sources. How do you identify a source? How do you make that first contact with the source and cultivate a relationship with the source? How does that work?
I think a lot of it starts from people you already know. Like being based in Beijing, you meet a lot of people who are involved in politics, who are involved in the system, so to speak. I can't say that I sort of have lunch regularly with like a great government source, but I do have lunch with like lots of people who are within the system, for lack of a better term, and then they will point you to other people whom